Let's assume for a moment that this product will guarantee a win. No question. It's the best thing since sliced bread. Understand that most folks will not buy from you because they don't know you yet.
I'm Eric Wilson, Managing Partner of Startup Caucus, an investment fund and incubator for Republican campaign technology. Welcome to the Business of Politics podcast. On this show, we bring you into conversation with the entrepreneurs who build best-in-class political businesses, the funders who provide the capital, and the operatives who put it all together to win campaigns. Today, we're joined by Shane Greer, the co-owner of Campaigns and Elections. The CNE website should be bookmarked for every listener of this podcast. It's a must-read for the political industry. Shane and his team also host the best conferences in the political space, bringing together professionals, operatives, and vendors from all around the world several times a year. We've had to do that virtually a lot lately, but finally getting back to in-person. On today's podcast, Shane and I discuss the professionalization of politics and how entrepreneurs can better reach their target customers in the political space. Shane, the mission of Campaigns and Elections is to be a how-to resource for political professionals. Explain to our listeners how you manage this in our really sharply divided partisan environment where half of your audience doesn't want to let the other half know its secrets.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting, right? But I kind of liken it to, let's say, an equivalent media organization in the commercial marketing space. And you might have, I don't know, folks who are from Chrysler and GM and Ford, marketing professionals all at a conference talking about what they're doing and how they're kind of finding new ways to reach consumers. Because yes, there is competition at play there, but ultimately, frankly, there isn't really that much of a secret sauce. And most of the time, people talking about having a secret sauce, it's snake oil.
That's a good really, red flag. Yeah.
Yeah. We have AI. Do you? There's a lot of talk of secret sauce, but actually a lot of what happens is just additional efficiencies on top of previously executed strategies and tactics. It's refinement. Yes, absolutely. New technologies come along, new methodologies come along, but it's an evolutionary process in which the campaign of tomorrow is building off the lessons of the campaign of the past and encountering a lot of the same problems, regardless of which side of the aisle you are, just as much as a marketing professional at Ford is going to encounter a lot of the same problems as a marketing professional at GM or something like that. And I guess the other side is because we're focused on the technical and CNE has been focused on the technical side of managing and winning political campaigns since it was founded in 1980, we don't talk about politics. I've yet to be at a CNE conference where I've spent much time at all talking to somebody about politics. I spend a lot of time picking their brains about how snackable ads has changed the creative process for media shops. I spend a lot of time talking to text vendors and people using texting about how 10 DLC regulations are going to change what they do. But I don't spend time talking about the ins and outs of this or that in the political arena, because it's a bit like you're talking to marketing folks again at sort of Ford or GM about marketing. You're not necessarily talking to them about the latest Ford Fusion.
I think another good point on this front is that it's unfortunate, but we're more polarized than ever. So I think Republicans and Democrats on the professional side of things are not actually competing over the same voters as they may have been 10, 20 years ago. And so you've got quite distinct populations, right, of users. So, the things that work for Democratic grassroots don't translate necessarily to Republican grassroots, although, there's some cross-pollination and idea sharing that goes on. But I do think that that's the unfortunate upshot of polarization of the electorate. And so, Shane, I didn't realize this until I looked it up, but you've been a part of Campaigns and Elections for 10 years now, which makes me feel really old. But what other trends stand out to you about professional politics over this decade that you've been involved?
Yeah, it's interesting. And I should say my initial involvement of CNE was kind of sitting in the UK as a director of a company that had been acquired. So it was much more high level looking at it than sort of in the weeds. So it's really only the last sort of 5 or 6 years since I, along with Shane Dearple, acquired the business that I've been in the weeds of the day to day. But the trends for me are interesting. And, CNE has this fascinating vantage point, both as, CNE US and also CNE Mexico, where we focus on the Latin American market, of seeing these kind of broad trends across the Americas and internationally in terms of how campaigns are executed. Obviously, if you look over the arc of the last 10 years, it's difficult to say anything other than how digital has exploded in importance and has transformed how campaigns think about measurement, has displaced and started to change some of the pre-existing assumptions about how you best reach voters. And, I think here of kind of cord cutters or the rise of OTT or social advertising or programmatic, whatever. There's just a much broader toolkit to reach into to direct messages to voters than there was even 10 years ago. So there's been this explosion in options for campaigns and an explosion of things to experiment with, which ultimately means that campaigns, particularly those further down the ballot where there are fewer resources, you're having to make a lot more really important decisions about what you focus on, where you put your effort, and how you measure the results in mediums that are often quite different in terms of how they're measured.
It has gotten so much more complicated for these down ballot races. So people running for state legislature or even city council in some cases, where you have so much more in terms of technology and options. The days of 3 TV channels, a cable system and a newspaper aren't going to cut it anymore. And so I think for folks who have been in the know and been involved with campaigns and elections have seen that sort of the convening for that transition over the last several years. Our listeners obviously know that Startup Caucus is an incubator for Republican campaign technology. And one of the most important things that we do with early stage companies is introduce them to political customers. Campaigns and elections, because of who your audience is often key point of entry for more established companies to reach the political industry. So from that vantage point, from working alongside these companies to tap into your audience, what distinguishes the most effective companies from those that struggle to make it in politics?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And I'm going to give you 2 different answers. And the 2 different answers apply to 2 completely different types of firms. The first one is the company that isn't pure play political. And I'm thinking here of, your obvious example would be some kind of ad tech firm, right? But there are plenty of others as well. But let's take a generic ad tech firm. Let's assume that they're headquartered in New York. Let's assume that the vast majority of their revenue comes from commercial sectors. And then suddenly a year out, maybe 2 years out at a stretch, somebody in the executive suite decides that, hey, we could make some money in political. Let's definitely go and do that. And what they do is they have someone in the New York office who they send down in the Acela once a week, maybe, with the assumption that they'll be able to cut into a significant chunk or grab a significant chunk of market share in political just by doing that. And those firms fail to appreciate that you have to invest over the long term in politics. You have to be present amongst political decision makers and buyers and having to build those relationships over time in order to win their trust. And trust is key in any sector, but particularly in political, where, it's not just about selling cars or candy bars. It's a very mission oriented thing. So they tend to take this view that, it's just another market. We can send someone down and once a week, when in reality, you really need to establish a base of operations. And that doesn't necessarily have to be a physical base of operations now as we work more remotely, but you have to be fully invested. You have to have people who are full-time focused on the market in order to really gain a foothold. And you have to measure success over a number of cycles, not just assume that you can jump in and out. Every cycle we see firms do this and they come in and you can almost pick them off at the beginning as those that are going to succeed and those that aren't. And the ones that aren't are the ones that aren't prepared to make the longer term investment in human capital, relationship building, and getting known. The other type of firm is the pure play political firm. And obviously there are any number of different verticals they might specialize in. But the biggest mistake I see, and it depends, some of this is about framing what your goal is with your business. But the biggest mistake I see is firms that perhaps stay smaller than they should. The principal who tries to do too much themselves and as a result is able to do less, be less successful than might otherwise be the case, and also ultimately not be able to deliver as much for their clients and prospective clients as would be the case if they, bit the bullet and added some additional staff if they can, or brought in some outside support, because it's like any business, right? If you want to grow, you can't do it all yourself. The other part to that, which is notable, and this isn't going to be true for every political firm, but if you start a political firm and you have any notion at all that you might want to sell it, if you're the only person that's doing the business day to day, or even if your role in it is central to that business existing, you're never going to be able to sell it because there is no business to sell. So the classic old adage of like the value walks out the door every day. Those are the two types of businesses that I see that don't succeed in politics and why they don't succeed.
Why do you think it is that political entrepreneurs are resistant to growing when they should?
So many different reasons, and some of it's going to be personality led, but I think some of it is this fear that if you give someone else a particular task to do, that they won't do it as well as you would do it. And in a lot of cases, that may be right. But part of being an effective leader is recognizing that when you delegate something, that, the person you delegate to might not do it the way you would do it, or maybe might not even do it as well as you would do it, but it frees you up to do other things that are ultimately more value delivering. I think that's a factor. I also think there's just the concern around, well, I'm going to add this overhead. This is going to cost me more. Is this actually going to pay off? Because, oftentimes you have to make forward-leaning investments in a business to invest ahead of growth. And those investments could be infrastructure. And talk about something that C&E did over the kind of COVID period. That was of this where you have to make a big upfront investment that isn't going to pay off for some time. Sometimes that's about human capital. Sometimes that, you need to hire somebody, but actually that isn't going to pay for itself for a bit of time. And that can be really, really scary. At the end of the day, if you run your own business, you maybe have a mortgage, you maybe have a family. Regardless, you certainly have bills to pay. So making decisions that seem like they might threaten that is a big decision to make. But ultimately, you can only grow as a business and only have a sustainable business if you are more than a 1-2 person shop, I think.
We've talked about this on the podcast and on Twitter before about the talent transition that's going on in politics right now, which is easier than ever to be a freelancer, but that's different from being a business owner and building a business. So let me frame this in a more positive term. So what's the most important thing that an entrepreneur, let's say they're starting out and they, maybe have an application elsewhere. I guess what I'm asking you to do is set aside like the big firms who's like, oh, there's a $14 billion industry this year. I want to parachute in. Let's talk about people who are actually committed to the long term, want to be a part of this space. What's the most important thing that entrepreneur needs to know about selling to political customers?
Wow. So the most important thing about selling to political customers, I had this specific conversation with a number of folks over the years. I'll have a chat with them. They're entering the political market, or they're already established, but they're looking to bring something new on board. And they'll say our product or whatever it is better than anything else. Here's why it's better than anything else. And I have to say to them, let's assume for a moment that this product will guarantee a win. No question. It's the best thing since sliced bread. Understand that most folks will not buy from you because they don't know you yet. You've got to establish relationships of trust in any market, and this market in particular, because it's different than, say, the commercial sector where you can afford to be more risk oriented. And for one simple reason, let's take McDonald's, and I've used this example at C&E events a number of times. Let's say, McDonald's, they want to test a new product in a market. Well, what they can do is they can set up a bunch of controls, right? They can roll out this new thing in Nebraska, roll out a similar thing at a different price, or the same thing at a different price in somewhere else. And then, in another place, they have their control where they don't have it at all. And they can test different mixes of advertising, and they can afford to take a shot on some entrepreneur who's come with them with some really interesting targeting technology or whatever it is to see if that works. Because worst case, they haven't sold that burger. Worst case, they don't sell as much of it. It isn't a success and they can shut it down. Whereas in political, everything comes down to that one day. You can't set up control groups in the way that you can in the commercial sector. And ultimately, the decision-making hurdle that you have to clear to sell something new into an ecosystem that is where win or loss comes down to one day and there's no redos, that's a tremendously high hurdle to clear. So you have to understand that relationships are really important. You have to take time to build those relationships of trust. And to scale over, your horizon for scaling is going to be directly related to how good your relationships are and how much time you've invested in building those relationships, which is one of the reasons why I think, entrepreneurs who have come out of political and start a political technology shop or something are, 99 times out of 100 going to do better than an entrepreneur who comes completely from outside political with a similar product and is trying to sell it into the market.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so it's something that, we deal with at Startup Caucus when talking with entrepreneurs and founders is that just because you have a superior product, you've got a better price point, you're incorrectly assuming that the political marketplace is more rational than other marketplaces or as rational. And so one of the things that we try and do with Startup Caucus is serve as that seal of approval. Because we are working with them and we're under the hood, you can trust that they are delivering on what it is that they're saying. And I'm not going to introduce you to a company that's not ready for prime time. You're listening to the Business of Politics show. I'm speaking with Shane Greer, who is the co-owner of Campaigns and Elections, the must-read website and community for anyone in the political industry. And Campaigns and Elections is, of course, also a business. And so, Shane, you're very much an entrepreneur yourself. What lessons can you share from building a business in this really specific niche?
I think one of the things that was attractive about C&E from an acquisition point of view was that it did serve a niche, and particularly a niche that is very asymmetric, right? Like trying to find out who does what in the political campaign space is a hell of a lot more difficult than it is to find out who does what in most other industries, at least in my experience. So it, as a niche media operation and serving a niche industry, it provides a gateway, a path, a platform for folks to get to know other folks, for folks to build relationships and so on. So the lessons for me, though, is that you have to really focus on providing opportunities for folks to really build relationships, whether that's through events or whether that's through reading the website and hearing about different operatives in the market or platforms in the market, tools, technologies. We provide a way for folks to interface, whether they're on the buy side or the sell side, or they're, simply operatives who are doing the day-to-day coalface work of trying to win elections. Our job is to try and remove some of that asymmetry and enable people to connect the dots and ultimately connect with one another. I think the biggest lesson for me in running not just this business, but any business, I'm a big fan of, I talk to so many folks about this who run their own businesses. There's a great article by Harvard Business Review in the 60s called Marketing Myopia. And the upshot of that article was it said that you really have to understand what business you're in. And the example it gave was of a number of rail freight operators who had gone out of business as things started to consolidate and bigger players were able to push them out. And the problem that they had was that they thought of themselves as rail operators, when in fact what they were in the business of was getting product from A to B. It just happened to be that they used rail as the mechanism to do that. But they could just as readily have been sea, air, car, or truck, whatever. So you really have to understand what you're in the business of. And for me, that's looking at something like C&E and saying, you know what, yes, we produce events. Yes, we produce best-in-class journalism for political professionals. But ultimately, those are the ways we do what we do. And what we do is connect buyers and sellers in the marketplace. It's how we connect experts with other experts. It's how we connect operatives with one another so that people in the industry are ultimately more informed, able to make better decisions in a resource-intensive environment. And we do that by connecting and educating. So the kind of, a lot of other, in my experience, publications, if they have a print magazine or whatever it is, they think of themselves as that's what they do. We're a magazine or we're an event producer. And we very much don't think like that. We see those things as the mechanisms by which we do what our primary goal is, what our real mission are, what our real business is.
Right. And your why is different than your what.
Exactly.
And so, one of those areas, and this is just for any media business today, is a community. And so you just launched the C&E community, which I'm a member of, encourage other people to check out as well. Explain your thought about building that out, the value that you add, especially in this sort of remote first pandemic world, and then what your vision is for that going forward.
I'll start with why we wanted to start a sort of a paid member community for a while. But what really gave us the impetus to do it was going back to April last year. And we all remember April last year, right? right? It was this kind of inflection point where suddenly we couldn't go to the things we used to go to. We were isolating and all of those kind of things. But for a business like ours, which pre-COVID produces a lot of events, and as you said at the top, kind of all the industry's main events, from campaign tech events through to the Read Awards, Creative Summit, things like that. Well, we weren't doing those events, but still we had our underlying mission, which was to connect folks in this space, to educate folks in this space, to ensure that they were equipped with the knowledge and relationships to make the best decisions for the campaigns and goals that they were ultimately pursuing. And as a result, it just seemed like the perfect time to launch a community where we could, we already have deep relationships in this industry. We've got a loyal base of subscribers, which we're, tremendously thankful for. But we wanted to, from amongst those people, establish a community of even deeper relationships, even more closely tied to the C&E brand, where we could provide a range of benefits to those individuals. And there are a couple of things I'd mention here. First is, what were those benefits that we saw? And then coming back to your question earlier about what stops folks from being successful in business. And the first part was, well, one, we produce best in class content through editorial, video interviews, discussions, and so on at our events. And we thought, well, okay, well, let's create premium content for our member community where they're getting the very best information to enable them to do their jobs better. And let's provide that as something that's only available to our community members. Let's also recognize that our most loyal sort of subscribers and event attendees, these are folks who come time and time again to C&E events, who exhibit at C&E events, who read C&E, and who enter things like the Read Awards. And let's give them a benefit of membership. So when you're a member, you pay less for those things because we're rewarding that kind of loyalty and giving you not just an incentive to be a member, but to lower the barrier to participation in kind of everything we do. And then the third part comes back to connecting people in the industry. And one of the things that's very much front and center for us moving forward is finding ways to bring community members together, whether that's with special receptions at events we're doing that are only for members, or get-togethers for members outside of conference portfolio, again, finding ways to bring people together.
I think a lot of people don't appreciate when they see, oh, there's a community around this and there's some paid membership. There's such a disconnect. People don't appreciate how much goes into building a community. And it's one of the hardest things to do is to cold start a community. You've obviously been able to draw on several decades of producing really quality work. And so really excited to see how the C&E community grows. Shane, for our listeners who are checking out the podcast, they're thinking about making the leap to political entrepreneurship, what are some of the possibilities or emerging opportunities that most excite you?
There's a lot going on, but I think one that I'm really interested to watch develop is essentially the creation of platforms and tools that better enable campaigns and organizations to pull together all these disparate sort of data sources and analytics, right? Where you can really start to build a meaningful picture of what's happening across your campaign. Because at the moment, you've got so many different things. You've got your TV buys and the sort of the limited analytics that you're getting there. You've got the programmatic, you've got your social, you've got your direct mail programs, you've got your fundraising kind of metrics and so on like that. There's so much data coming into a modern campaign, way more than there was even a few years ago. And the amount of data you have coming in only grows the further up the ballot you go. Although I should note that the challenge of managing that data is much larger down ballot because you're more resource strapped. So I think entrepreneurs who come in to build platforms and tools that help campaigns make more sense of that data, help campaigns turn that data into actionable intelligence that they can make better decisions off, make more timely decisions off, find ways to spend more efficiently, I think is going to be really, really transformative. Because at the moment we exist in a campaign world that is awash in data, a tidal wave of data every day. But the more that data can be made manageable, usable, and more easily interpreted, the better campaigns are going to fare as a result. So I think there's a huge opportunity for entrepreneurs who are thinking about that.
I agree 100%. It's not an issue of data. It's an issue of too much data. So if anyone's listening and wants to start a business around that, I'd love to talk to them and invest in it. I want to transition now because our listeners may have picked up that you have an accent. You gave the hint that it's from the United Kingdom, but you're from Northern Ireland. You grew up there. And, I think the conflict there is probably the closest or most recent touch point for what happens when a political system breaks down and violence takes over. What warning signs, if any, do you see about our politics in the United States that you recognize from your own childhood and growing up in Northern Ireland?
Wow. The short answer is so many.
Not the answer we were looking for.
Yeah. So the country is different. The kind of political systems are different. So there's a lot of structural differences that will result in very different outcomes. I don't know what those outcomes ultimately are, but that's all to say that we're all a function of kind of the societies we live in. But what I notice is growing up during the Troubles, whatever community you were in that community, and the other side was very much the other. The term in Northern Ireland, the generic term for the other side, regardless of which side you're on, is themins. Them ones. And this notion that they were different, that they were not just different in their view, but just different from you, opposed to you, that what they wanted was irreconcilable with what you wanted, that their notion of what the place was, the country you were in, the region you were in, was fundamentally different. When I look at the US, I see a lot of that, as well. You talked about polarization at the top. And, what's interesting to me is you can chat to some Democrats, you can chat to some Republicans. I'm not even talking about operatives here. I'm just talking about like voters, and who very genuinely believe that the other side is un-American, that the other side is out to destroy their way of life, that their way of life represents the kind of true form of America. And that's very dangerous, because how do you reach a point of common understanding? How do you have a shared vision for what a place is, even if you have different goals for how that place might develop? How do you create a shared sense of identity when identity itself is a wedge issue? So I see a lot of parallels that are quite concerning. Now, there are differences that make me think it's not suddenly going to turn out into some kind of ethno-nationalist conflict like I grew up with. But there are certainly warning signs that discord could grow and that could have really dangerous fallout, including violence. We saw some of that on January 6th, and we've seen it in other forms as well. For me, there are a lot of warning signs, but one hopes that the very fact that we're even thinking about that gives us the wherewithal to better navigate it and come to a situation where you can continue to have political disagreement, but that you don't see that person who lives in a different city or state as being not just different from you, but intent on your destruction, sees you as an enemy, etc.
That's really helpful. Thanks for sharing that perspective, which is surprisingly timely. One book I would recommend to listeners if they want to check it out is Say Nothing by Patrick Radden Keefe. Is probably one of the better reads about the Troubles that I've checked out. And the big takeaway for me, Shane, is that political violence is not worth it. You're never going to get out of it what you put into it. And so it is this act of desperation for someone with nothing left to lose. And that was a really important insight for me. So let's give some optimism. What gives you hope about the future of our politics in the United States?
I think what gives me hope is something that I have long loved about the United States. It's difficult to put your finger on kind of one word that describes it, but there is a natural optimism in America and Americans that is not only refreshing versus my experience, say, growing up in Northern Ireland or UK. But the way I give this example is, Leslie, you have a friend that comes to you and you go, you know what, Shane, I've got this idea for a business. It's this, that, or the other. The natural American response to that friend is to go, oh, that's awesome. Oh, that would work this way. Oh, you should look at this thing. Oh, I got to connect you with my friend over here who does this that might be relevant to it. It's this kind of embrace of the new, this embrace of this idea that something can be built and that it's better than what was there before. Whereas in so many other places, the reaction would be, oh, that sounds a bit dangerous, or, oh, that's not how we do things. So what gives me hope is Americans and America's natural sense of optimism that it can build the future that it wants, and that the future it builds will ultimately be better than what went before, and much better for our children, children's children, and so on. So America's natural sense of optimism is what actually makes me optimistic that over the long term, these issues we deal with at the moment will be in the rearview mirror and the subject of historical analysis rather than day-to-day concern.
I hope you're right. And I certainly am optimistic about our future. And so with that, I want to say thank you to Shane for really amazing conversation. Please go check out Campaigns and Elections at campaignsandelections.com. Best way to keep track of what they're doing is signing up for their newsletter. Really great stuff several times a week. So go check that out. And if you're able to, make it to one of these conferences. There are a lot more, sort of virtual participation options, although we're hoping that we get to be back in person more. I want to, again, thank you, Shane, for all the work that you do for the industry and the community, as well as for joining us today. Listeners can subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen. And if you enjoyed this conversation, I'd really appreciate it if you would share it with a friend, if it made you smarter. And if you enjoyed listening, give us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, wherever you listen, because it really helps with people discovering and finding it out. So with that, we look forward to chatting with you next time on the Business of Politics show.